They called him the cartographer of the damned, though never to his face. The name came from the junior scribes who processed the Outer Rim reports, whispered when they thought I could not hear them over the grinding servitor mechanisms in Archive Section 93. I never discouraged it. A man who maps the domains of the Great Rift's interior deserves a title that acknowledges the weight of his service. For 16 years, I had traced the boundaries of the Imperium Nihilus, cataloging every verified settlement, every astropathic scream that confirmed continued Imperial presence within that wounded sector of reality. My work gave the administratum eyes where the Astronomican's light could not reach. My faith in that purpose was absolute. My name is Corvus Thane, third-class cartographic analyst of the Departamento Munitorum Subsector Command, and I need you to understand something before this testimony ends. I believed I was performing sacred work. I believed every world I marked on those charts mattered to someone, somewhere, who would send aid. I believed the Imperium abandoned no one. I was 34 years old when I learned that precision and faith are not the same thing, and that the Emperor's servants sometimes keep more accurate records of their deliberate failures than their triumphs. The archive chamber, where I worked, measured 47 meters across its vaulted ceiling, supported by columns inscribed with saints' names in Gothic script too small to read without magnification. The temperature held steady at 11 degrees, cold enough that my breath misted when I spoke aloud to verify coordinates. I preferred it that way. The cold kept my mind sharp during the long shifts when I cross-referenced astropathic transmissions against established settlement records. My station occupied the northeast corner, a desk of blackwood worn smooth by centuries of use, equipped with 3 data slates, 1 cogitator terminal with authorization clearance level Vermilion 7, and a ceremonial quill I used for final chart notations. The quill had been my predecessor's, and his predecessors before that, passed down through 11 generations of cartographers. Its nib was genuine gold, blessed by a cardinal of the ecclesiarchy. When I dipped it in sanctified ink and marked a new settlement on the master charts, I was adding to a continuous record stretching back 6,000 years. That continuity mattered. It proved we endured. It proved we remembered. My typical shift began at the 4th bell of the morning cycle, marked by the deep resonance of brass chimes that echoed through the archive's stone corridors. I would arrive before the servitors completed their dust removal routines, stepping over their cleaning appendages as they scraped and polished. The air always smelled of old parchment, machine oil, and the faint sweetness of the sanctified wax used to seal the master chart tubes. I would light the devotional candles at my desk, 3 of them arranged in the Aquila formation, and recite the litany of accurate record-keeping while the cogitator warmed through its initialization sequence. The prayer took 4 minutes. By the time I finished, green phosphor text would flicker across the cogitator's display, confirming connection to the broader Munitorum data network. Then, the real work began. Each transmission from the Imperium Nihilus arrived as fragmentary data, often corrupted by the psychic turbulence that characterized warp space within the rift. My task was to decode these fragments, verify their authenticity against known settlement registries, and update the master charts accordingly. A single transmission might take hours to process. I would compare signal timestamps against astropathic choir rosters to confirm the message originated from an authorized source. I would check the coordinates against previous records to verify consistency. I would analyze the message content for signs of daemonic corruption or falsification. Only after these verification protocols did I mark the settlement as confirmed active on the charts. The process demanded absolute precision. A misplaced coordinate could send relief convoys to empty space. A false confirmation could waste resources desperately needed elsewhere. I took pride in my accuracy rate of 99.73%. In 16 years, I had made exactly 41 verified errors. I remembered each one. I had prayed for forgiveness for each one. The work felt meaningful because I could see its impact. Every 3 months, representatives from the Munitorum Strategic Planning Division would requisition my updated charts. They would study the patterns of confirmed settlements, identifying clusters that might support supply depot establishment or relief convoy routing. When I marked a new world as active, I imagined the chain of decisions that would follow. Somewhere, a logistics officer would note the update. Resources would be allocated. Perhaps a single transport would be dispatched with medical supplies, or astropathic relay equipment, or simply rations to feed a starving population. My charts formed the foundation of those decisions. Without accurate mapping, the Imperium Nihilus became merely a blank space labeled beyond reliable contact. With my work, it remained a collection of specific places populated by specific servants of the Emperor who deserved remembrance and aid. That distinction mattered profoundly. I believed in the system because I had witnessed its function. 3 years into my service, I had processed a transmission from a settlement called Mordant's Hope, a mining colony on a world designated Terminus 7743. The astropathic message was barely coherent, fragmented by interference, but I managed to extract coordinates and a desperate plea for medica supplies to combat a plague outbreak. I logged it. I updated the charts. I forwarded the intelligence to strategic planning as protocol required. 8 months later, a follow-up transmission arrived from Mordant's Hope, thanking the Emperor's mercy for the relief convoy that had arrived bearing vaccine shipments. The message included my archive designation number, crediting my initial report. I kept that commendation in my personal effects, a small parchment scroll sealed with the colony administrator's sign. It proved the work mattered. It proved I mattered. My supervisor was an ancient woman named Castria Ven, her spine bent from 9 decades of hunching over data slates. Her eyes replaced decades ago with augmetic lenses that clicked and whirred when she examined documents. She rarely spoke except to deliver performance assessments or to verify my most sensitive findings. But once, during my 5th year, she had paused at my desk while reviewing my quarterly accuracy report. She had placed one gnarled hand on my shoulder. Her augmetic fingers cold through my robe's fabric and said in her thin, reedy voices, "Your faith makes your work flawless, Thane. Never forget that precision is a form of prayer." I had not forgotten. I recited those words to myself during the long hours when my eyes burned from staring at phosphor displays and my hand cramped from notation work. Precision was prayer. Accuracy was devotion. Every correctly plotted coordinate was an offering to the Emperor's eternal vigil. The archive followed strict schedule protocols. We worked in 8-hour shifts separated by 4 hours of mandatory rest, prayer, and sustenance intake. Meals arrived via servitor at designated intervals, delivered in metal trays bearing the Munitorum seal. The food varied little, reconstituted protein paste flavored with synthetic nutrients, dense grain cakes, and weak recaf that tasted of metal and old grounds. I consumed it without complaint. Better men than I subsisted on far less in the Emperor's service. During rest periods, I would walk the archive's perimeter corridors, exercising my legs to prevent circulatory stasis. The corridors were silent except for my footsteps and the distant grinding of climate control mechanisms. Sometimes I would pass other cartographers, but we rarely spoke. Our work demanded concentration that did not easily release its grip on our thoughts. The archive's lighting came from luminous strips mounted along the ceiling, their pale glow calibrated to minimize eye strain during extended data analysis. The strips flickered occasionally, brief interruptions in the steady illumination that I had learned to ignore. Everything in the archive had aged beyond its intended service life. The Imperium maintained what it could, but resources flowed toward active war zones, not toward record-keeping facilities on stable worlds far from immediate threat. We made do. The servitors, joints ground bone on metal from inadequate lubrication. The cogitators took longer each year to complete initialization sequences. The candles I lit each morning came from stocks manufactured centuries ago. They're wax-brittle and prone to irregular burning. But the work continued. That was what mattered. I had colleagues, though I knew them more as presences than personalities. The archive employed 47 cartographers across 3 shifts, plus 73 servitors and 21 administrative personnel. Most cartographers specialized in specific subsectors. I held responsibility for grid sections Primus through Sextus of the Imperium Nihilus, a region encompassing approximately 400 light-years of warp-scarred space. My nearest colleague, a man named Vex Halloran, who mapped grid sections Septimus through Decimus, worked 3 desks distant. We exchanged professional courtesies during shift transitions, but rarely conversed beyond necessity. The work demanded isolation. Too much conversation broke concentration, introduced errors, allowed the mind to drift from the sacred precision our task required. In my 16th year of service, on a day that began like any other, I processed a transmission that did not make sense. The message originated from a settlement registered as Absalom's Reach, coordinates verified against the master registry as accurate. The astropathic signature matched known Twire patterns from that sector, but the message content consisted of a single repeated phrase in Imperial Gothic. "We are still here. We are still here. We are still here." No request for aid, no status report. Just that phrase, transmitted across the warp's howling chaos with what must have been enormous psychic expense and physical suffering for the astropaths involved. I logged it as I logged everything, noting the unusual content in my report. Then I consulted the historical files for Absalom's Reach to check for previous communications. The historical record showed 43 prior transmissions from Absalom's Reach over the past 16 years, all logged, all verified, all properly processed. But as I reviewed them in sequence, I noticed something wrong. The transmissions showed no progression, no development, no change in circumstance. Each message was essentially identical confirmation of continued imperial loyalty. Statement of population count, request for supply convoy consideration. The population count never changed. Exactly 4,300,000 souls, reported in every transmission across 16 years. No births, no deaths, no variance whatsoever. I checked my own previous processing notes. I had logged each transmission as accurate. I had never questioned the consistency. I told myself there must be explanation. Perhaps the population count represented an administrative district that maintained stable numbers through immigration and emigration. Perhaps the transmissions used standardized formats that did not require demographic updates. Perhaps I was seeing patterns where none existed, my mind manufacturing mystery from the fatigue of too many hours staring at data. I almost filed the observation away and continued my work, but precision demanded investigation. If the records were incorrect, they needed correction. If I had made errors in my previous processing, I needed to identify and rectify them. I submitted a formal query to the Administratum Demographics Division requesting verification of Absalom's Reach population statistics. The response arrived 6 weeks later, during my usual 4th bell shift. A junior administratum functionary delivered it personally rather than routing it through standard data channels, which should have been my first indication something was irregular. He was young, perhaps 20 standard years, with the soft hands of someone who had never performed manual labor. He placed a sealed data slate on my desk, had me verify my identity and clearance level, then departed without meeting my eyes. The seal was Vermilion 8, one clearance level above my own authorized access. I broke it with trembling fingers I did not understand. The response was brief. Demographics Division had no record of a settlement called Absalom's Reach in my assigned grid sections. No population registry existed for those coordinates. The designation appeared in my cartographic files, but nowhere else in the broader administratum data architecture. Furthermore, attempting to verify the settlement through alternative records had triggered a priority flag in the archives. Consistency, Review Bureau. My query had been noted. My work would be subject to enhanced oversight for the next fiscal quarter. The data slate's final line read, recommend discontinuing investigation of anomalous entries. Focus efforts on verified settlements only. I sat at my desk for 23 minutes without moving, watching my breath mist in the cold air, listening to the servitors grind through their cleaning routines. The candles at my desk burned steady, their flames unwavering in the still air. I had logged transmissions from Absalom's Reach for 16 years. I had marked it on the master charts with the blessed quill. I had forwarded its requests for aid to strategic planning. And according to Demographics Division, the settlement did not exist, could not exist, had never existed in their records. The rational explanations presented themselves immediately. Administrative error was common across the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. Perhaps Absalom's Reach existed, but had been registered under a different designation in Demographics Division files. Perhaps my grid section assignment overlapped with another cartographer's territory, creating duplicate entries. Perhaps the settlement had been destroyed or evacuated between my initial logging and Demographics Division's current record keeping, and the updates had not propagated through all system networks. I wanted to accept these explanations. I wanted to return to my work and forget the inconsistency. But precision demanded I understand. I began reviewing my other logged settlements with new scrutiny, checking each against available administratum records where my clearance permitted access. Most showed proper correlation, but as I worked through the files systematically, I found others like Absalom's Reach, settlements I had confirmed through astropathic transmission that existed nowhere in official demographic records. 7 in total across my 16 years of service. 7 confirmed settlements with no supporting documentation beyond the transmissions I had processed. 7 coordinate sets marked on the master charts that, according to the broader administratum, corresponded to empty space. The discrepancies fell into patterns I had not noticed before. All 7 settlements showed identical characteristics: consistent population counts across multiple transmissions, standardized message formats, regular transmission intervals spaced exactly 17 months apart. The transmissions themselves contained no specific details, no personal names, no references to local leadership or governance structures. They read like template messages, formulaic confirmations of continued existence without substance or individuality. I had processed them as legitimate because they matched the format of genuine transmissions. I had verified them against my settlement registries because they appeared there. I had never questioned whether the registries themselves might be wrong. I should have stopped. The recommendation was clear: discontinue investigation, focus on verified settlements. But 16 years of training in precision would not release me. If my charts contained errors, they needed correction. If my settlement registries were corrupted, they needed purging. I needed to understand how this had happened, because if I did not understand, I could not prevent it from happening again. And if I could not prevent errors, my work had no meaning. My faith in the system's function depended on its accuracy. Without accuracy, there was only chaos. I requested access to the master transmission archives, the secure vault where original astropathic recordings were stored before processing. My clearance level permitted limited access for verification purposes. The archive keeper, a servitor with more machine than flesh remaining, verified my identity and escorted me into the vault's climate-controlled chamber. The recordings existed as psychic impressions, burned into specially prepared crystals, each crystal housed in a sealed containment cylinder marked with the transmission date and origin coordinates. I located the cylinder for the first Absalom's Reach transmission dated 16 years prior and requested playback authorization. The servitor inserted the crystal into a playback device, a brass mechanism connected to a small pict screen. The recording activated, but instead of an astropathic choir's psychic impression, translated into audio and visual data. The screen showed only static and the audio emitted a sound like distant screaming filtered through water. The servitor checked the device's calibration, ran diagnostic protocols, attempted playback again. Same result, corruption or damage to the crystal. The servitor logged the degradation and moved to retrieve another sample. I requested all 7 Absalom's Reach transmissions. Every crystal showed identical corruption. Perfect static, distant screaming. No actual message content. Yet I had processed these transmissions. I had extracted coordinates and message data from them. I had verified them through standard protocols. Either my memory was false, or the crystals had been replaced, or something had corrupted them in the years since I first accessed them. The servitor informed me in its flat mechanical voice that crystal corruption of this nature was theoretically impossible. The containment cylinders prevented electromagnetic interference, psychic resonance, or physical degradation. The crystals should remain stable for millennia, yet these had failed. All 7. The exact 7 I needed to verify. I returned to my desk with hands that would not stop shaking. I lit new candles to replace those that had burned down during my absence. I recited the litany of accurate record keeping, but the words felt hollow in my mouth, empty sounds without conviction. I accessed my cogitator and pulled up the master charts, the centuries-old documents I updated with the blessed quill. I found Absalom's Reach marked in my own hand, dated 3 years prior during a routine chart update. The notation was perfect. My script precise, the coordinates exact. I had made that mark. I remembered making it. But if the settlement did not exist in official records, if the transmission crystals were corrupted beyond recovery, what exactly had I been mapping? My supervisor's words echoed, "Your faith makes your work flawless." But faith required trust in something beyond myself. I had trusted the transmissions because they arrived through secured channels. I had trusted my settlement registries because they came from administratum archives. I had trusted my own processing because I followed verified protocols. Now I understood that trust and verification were not synonymous. I had been trusting when I should have been verifying. Or perhaps I had been verifying the wrong things. I needed to speak with Vex Halloran, my nearest colleague. If my registries contained errors, perhaps his did as well. Perhaps this was a systemic issue affecting multiple cartographers, something we could report jointly to Supervisor Venn for correction. I waited until the shift change bell sounded, then approached Halloran's desk as he prepared to depart. He was older than I, perhaps 50 standard years, his hair gone entirely gray, his movements careful and deliberate from joint pain he refused to have treated. I asked him quietly if he had ever found inconsistencies between his logged settlements and official administratum records. Halloran's face went carefully blank. He finished organizing his data slates with precise movements, placed them in his desk's locked drawer, and stood to face me fully. His voice was low, barely audible over the grinding servitors. I process transmissions. I update charts. I maintain accuracy above 99%. That is my function. I do not question the sources. He paused, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment before sliding away. I recommend you adopt the same approach, Tane, for your own peace of mind. He left the archive without another word. I stood at his empty desk, surrounded by the vast silence of the chamber, and understood that I had asked a question others had already asked and learned not to answer. Halloran knew. Perhaps others knew. They had learned to process and log and update without questioning what they were actually documenting. They had chosen functional ignorance over dangerous certainty. And in that choice, they had remained employed, remained useful, remained at their desks year after year while others perhaps had not. That night in my assigned quarters, a cube measuring 3 meters by 3 meters containing a cot, a small shrine to the Emperor, and a wash basin, I could not sleep. I kept seeing those 7 settlement names in my mind, perfect notations on ancient charts, marking coordinates that corresponded to nothing. I kept hearing that recommendation. Discontinue investigation. I kept remembering Halloran's careful blank expression, the way he had looked at me, like I was standing on the edge of something he had learned to step back from decades ago. My faith said the Imperium was vast and complex, but ultimately functional. That records might contain errors, but the system corrected itself. That service mattered because somewhere, someone was benefiting from my work. But evidence suggested I had spent 16 years mapping phantoms. The next morning, I arrived at my desk before the fourth bell. While the archive still held its deepest silence, I logged into my cogitator and began a different kind of search. Instead of checking individual settlements against demographic records, I began analyzing patterns in my own transmission logs. I noted timing, frequency, content structure, coordinate distribution. I looked for anomalies not in what the data said, but in how it behaved across time. And I found something that made my breath stop in my lungs. Every settlement that appeared in demographic records transmitted irregularly, with gaps ranging from 3 to 47 months between messages. The content varied widely, reflecting changing circumstances, leadership transitions, crisis events. But the 7 settlements that existed only in my files transmitted with mechanical regularity, exactly 17 months between each message, variance of less than 6 hours. The probability of natural transmission patterns maintaining that precision across multiple settlements over 16 years approached 0. These were not irregular astropathic communications from desperate colonies. These were scheduled transmissions following a predetermined pattern. Artificial, deliberate, false. I sat back in my chair, the cold archive air burning my lungs, and forced myself to think through implications. Someone was generating false transmissions and routing them through secured channels to reach cartographers like myself. The false transmissions matched format and authentication protocols closely enough to pass standard verification. They appeared in settlement registries, but nowhere else in the administratum data architecture. And when questioned, the evidence degraded or disappeared. This was not administrative error. This was not corruption in the common sense of heretical taint. This was systematic falsification of records, executed with precision and institutional support. But why? What purpose did it serve to create phantom settlements? What benefit came from convincing cartographers like myself that empty coordinates contained imperial populations? I could imagine no rational explanation, unless the purpose was not deception of enemies, but deception of those doing the mapping. Unless the goal was to make the Imperium Nihilus appear more populated, more salvageable, more worthy of continued resource allocation than reality supported. Unless someone needed the charts to show hope where none existed. I thought of the relief convoy to Mordant's hope, the commendation I had received, the proof that my work mattered. I pulled the file. I cross-referenced it against demographic records. Mordant's hope existed. The transmission patterns showed appropriate irregularity. The message content included specific personnel names, detailed plague symptoms, precise Medicare supply requests. It was real. The colony was real. The convoy had been real. I had helped save lives there. That anchor remained solid. But how many other convoys had been dispatched to coordinates I had confirmed? How many relief efforts had been sent to empty space, wasting resources that could have supported real settlements facing genuine crisis? If 7 of my logged settlements were phantoms, how many phantoms existed in the work of 47 cartographers across decades of service? How many trillions of thrones had been allocated based on charts mapping nothing? I needed to speak with Supervisor Ven. She had served in the archive for 9 decades. She had trained every cartographer currently employed. If anyone would know the truth of this, it would be her. I submitted a formal request for private consultation, citing concerns regarding data integrity in my assigned sections. The request was approved within hours, unusual speed that suggested my questions were being tracked. I was instructed to report to Ven's office immediately following the 3rd prayer bell. Her office was smaller than I expected, barely larger than my own quarters, dominated by a desk of dark wood and walls covered with ancient charts dating back millennia. She sat behind her desk like a monument to time, bent and ancient, her augmetic eyes clicking as they focused on my face. She gestured to a chair without speaking. I sat. The chair was deliberately uncomfortable, designed to discourage lengthy conversations. I began carefully, explaining my investigation in clinical terms, focusing on data inconsistencies rather than accusations. I presented my findings: the 7 settlements absent from demographic records, the corrupted transmission crystals, the mechanical regularity of phantom transmissions. I finished by asking her directly, "Supervisor, I need to understand if my settlement registries are compromised. I need to know if my work has been corrupted by false data. I need clarity to maintain accuracy." Ven was silent for long enough that I wondered if she had heard me. Her augmetic eyes whirred and clicked, focusing and refocusing on my face. Then she spoke, her voice thin and brittle as old parchment. "Thane, how many settlements have you confirmed in 16 years of service?" 473. "Supervisor, and how many have you now identified as potentially false?" 7. "Supervisor, 7 out of 473. She leaned forward slightly, her ancient hands flat on the desk's surface. "What is your accuracy rate?" I calculated automatically. 98.52%, Supervisor. Higher than the Departamento Munitorum standard requirement of 95%. Higher than your own previous best. By what standard are you measuring your work as compromised? Her augmetic eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment I saw something behind them. Some flicker of recognition or warning, or perhaps just wariness. "You perform sacred work, Thane. You maintain records that guide strategic decisions across entire sectors. 7 anomalies across 16 years represents exceptional precision, not failure. But those 7 settlements do not exist, Supervisor. The resources allocated based on my confirmations were wasted." "Were they?" Ven leaned back, her chair creaking. "Tell me, Thane, what do you believe happens when a settlement is marked on the charts?" "Strategic planning reviews the updated data and determines resource allocation priorities. And if a settlement is not marked," I hesitated, "then it receives no consideration for aid." "Precisely." Ven's hands trembled slightly as she arranged a data slate on her desk, aligning it parallel to the desk's edge with careful precision. "The Imperium Nihilus contains approximately 8,000 worlds beyond reliable astropathic contact. Our resources can support meaningful aid to perhaps 200 per solar cycle. Strategic planning must therefore choose which settlements receive support and which are classified as expendable. They base these decisions on our charts." She paused, her augmetic eyes clicking. "What happens, Thane, if our charts show too few settlements to justify continued resource allocation to the entire sector?" Understanding crept through me like cold water. Strategic planning might determine the entire sector is unsalvageable and reallocate resources elsewhere. Correct. And what happens to the real settlements? The genuine colonies of imperial citizens still struggling to survive in the rift. They would be abandoned entirely. Correct. Ven's voice held no satisfaction, no triumph, only deep exhaustion. "So we maintain the charts. We confirm sufficient settlements to justify continued support for the sector. We demonstrate that the Imperium Nihilus remains viable, that populations persist, that hope endures, and strategic planning continues allocating resources that save real lives on real worlds, even if some of those resources are wasted on coordinates that hold nothing. 7 phantom settlements among 473 real ones. That is the cost of maintaining hope, Than. That is the price of preventing total abandonment." I sat in that uncomfortable chair, in that small office surrounded by ancient charts, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding. "You know, you have always known. I have served the Emperor for 9 decades. I have mapped the Imperium's domains through the age of apostasy, the plague of unbelief, the Gothic War, the devastation of Baal, and the opening of the Great Rift. I have learned that truth must sometimes be managed to serve a greater purpose. She leaned forward again, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I am not asking you to lie, Thane. I am asking you to understand that your work serves the living, not abstract accuracy. Those 7 phantom settlements keep the sector viable. The hundreds of real settlements depend on that viability for any hope of aid. Would you sacrifice the real to purge the false? The administratum could be informed. Strategic planning could adjust their allocation models. We could maintain accurate charts and still justify support. Ven's laugh was bitter, humorless. You believe the administratum operates on logic and reason. Strategic planning receives resource requests from 10,000 sectors simultaneously. They allocate based on priority assessments derived from projected returns on investment. The Imperium Nihilus cannot compete on those terms. It is broken, dangerous, expensive to support. The only reason resources flow there at all is because our charts suggest enough viable populations to justify the expense. If we report the truth, if we admit how few settlements actually remain functional, if we acknowledge the scale of losses, the entire sector becomes a resource sink without return. It will be classified as write-off territory and abandoned to its fate. She paused, her trembling hands now flat on the desk as if bracing against something. I have made this choice every day for 9 decades, Thane. I have authorized false registries, approved corrupted data, maintained the fiction of viability, because the alternative is extinction for everyone who remains alive in that emperor-forsaken sector. And I have lived with the weight of it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to insist there must be another way. That truth and service were not oppositions, that the Imperium, I believed, in would not abandon its citizens based on accounting assessments. But I looked at Ven, at 9 decades of service carved into her bent spine and trembling hands, at the wariness in her augmetic eyes, and I understood she had wrestled with these questions longer than I had been alive. She had chosen her path. She had maintained it across the better part of a century. And she was asking me to make the same choice. What happened to the cartographers who refused? I asked quietly. They were reassigned to less sensitive duties. Archive maintenance, servitor oversight, positions where their scruples could not endanger operational necessity. Ven's voice held neither threat nor reassurance, only statement of fact. The work we do requires a particular kind of faith, Thane. Faith that serving the living sometimes requires compromising with imperfection. You may choose otherwise. I will not compel you. But I need you to understand what that choice means for people you will never meet on worlds you will never visit who depend on resources allocated because we convinced strategic planning they still matter. I left her office with no clear sense of time's passage, walking through archive corridors that suddenly felt foreign, lit by luminous strips that flickered with new meaning. Every surface, every document, every carefully maintained record carried the weight of deliberate deception. Not corruption in the sense of chaos taint or moral decay, but systematic falsification in service of a goal I had never questioned. Keeping the Imperium Nihilus viable long enough for aid to reach those still surviving there. The logic was sound. The necessity was real. And I felt something inside me beginning to crack. I returned to my desk and sat motionless while the shift changed around me, while servitors ground through their routines, while other cartographers arrived and departed without acknowledging my presence. I stared at the master charts, at notations made with the blessed quill across centuries, and wondered how many were real, how many settlements had actually existed at the coordinates so carefully marked, how many phantom populations had been maintained to keep the charts looking viable, how many generations of cartographers had known and chosen to continue the deception, because the alternative was worse. My faith had told me the Imperium was vast and complex, but ultimately good, that it served humanity's survival through coordination of resources across impossible distances. I had believed my work contributed to that service, that every confirmed settlement brought aid closer to desperate populations. I had believed accuracy mattered because truth mattered. Now I understood accuracy and truth were different things. I could be accurate in documenting falsehoods. I could be truthful in acknowledging failure. But I could not be both accurate and truthful while serving the living. Over the following weeks, I continued my work mechanically, processing transmissions without investigating their authenticity, updating charts without cross-referencing demographic records, maintaining my 99% accuracy rate through willful blindness. I became efficient at not thinking too deeply about what I was documenting. I learned to recognize phantom settlements by their mechanical regularity and simply process them like any other data without questioning. I learned to be Holleran, blank-faced and careful, performing my function without examining its foundations. But I could not stop the questions entirely. They rose during rest periods, during prayers, during the long dark hours in my quarters when sleep would not come. If my work sustained a deception, what else in the Imperium operated on similar logic? If strategic planning made allocation decisions based on deliberately falsified data, what other decisions were built on foundations of managed truth? If the administratum accepted that preserving hope required manufacturing evidence of viability, where did such management end? How much of what I believed about the Imperium's function was real, and how much was necessary fiction, maintained to prevent despair? I began reviewing other aspects of my work with new scrutiny. I examined the settlement transmission patterns more carefully, looking not for phantoms but for other anomalies. And I found them. Real settlements whose population counts dropped sharply between transmissions, suggesting catastrophic losses, followed by requests for aid that were never logged in strategic planning forwards. Real settlements that stopped transmitting entirely, marked as contact lost, in my files but not removed from the active charts. Real settlements whose transmissions described conditions so desperate, so hopeless, that I could not imagine how they continued functioning, yet no relief convoys were ever dispatched to their coordinates. I checked the master distribution records, the logs showing which of my confirmed settlements had been forwarded to strategic planning for aid consideration. The 7 phantom settlements were always forwarded. They appeared in every quarterly report, maintaining consistent presence in the data strategic planning used for allocation models. But many real settlements with verified populations and documented crises, were not forwarded. They existed in my files, but not in the reports. They were confirmed, but not supported. They were real, but not viable enough to justify resource allocation. The pattern became clear across months of investigation I conducted in stolen moments between official duties. The phantom settlements served not just to inflate overall numbers, but to replace real settlements deemed unsalvageable. A mining colony reporting 90% population loss from plague would be quietly dropped from strategic planning forwards, while a phantom settlement with stable population would be added to maintain total count. A forge world describing infrastructure collapse and demonic incursions would be marked, contact lost, while a phantom settlement would begin transmitting from nearby coordinates, preserving the appearance of continued imperial presence in that subsector. The charts maintain the fiction of stability by substituting false hope for real suffering. I documented everything in a private file, encrypted with the highest level clearance my position permitted. I recorded settlement names, transmission dates, cross-references between real and phantom entries. I built a complete picture of the deception's architecture across my assigned grid sections, and, as the evidence accumulated, I understood I was documenting something that could destroy the entire system I served. If this data were released, if strategic planning learned they had been making allocation decisions based on falsified intelligence. The Imperium Nihilus would be reclassified as total loss. Aid would cease. Every real settlement still transmitting would be abandoned. Millions would die who might otherwise survive. But if I remained silent, I became complicit in the deception. Every phantom settlement I confirmed, every real settlement I failed to forward, every quarterly report I submitted maintaining the fiction. I became responsible for the waste and misallocation it caused. Resources sent to empty coordinates were resources denied to desperate populations. Convoys dispatched to phantom settlements were convoys that never reached real colonies. My work was not neutral. My silence was not passive. Every choice I made had consequences. I requested another meeting with Supervisor Ven. This time I came with my private documentation, the complete record of the deception I had uncovered. I placed the encrypted data slate on her desk and told her everything I had found. The substitution of phantom settlements for real ones. The suppression of forwarding for unsalvageable colonies. The systematic management of strategic planning intelligence to maintain appearance of viability. I finished by asking the question that had been consuming me. How many people have died because resources went to empty coordinates instead of real populations? Ven examined my documentation in silence, her augmetic eyes scanning the data slate's contents while her trembling hands rested flat on her desk. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression I could not decipher. "You have been thorough, Thane. Admirably thorough." She paused, her mechanical eyes clicking. "And now you want to know what to do with this information. I want to know if there is any way to serve truthfully, any way to maintain accurate charts without condemning the sector to abandonment." No. Her answer was flat, final. There is not. The system functions as designed. We deceive strategic planning because strategic planning requires deception to justify continued support. They know this. We know they know this. Everyone involved understands the game being played. But the game must continue because stopping it means admitting the Imperium Nihilus is not salvageable. And that admission triggers bureaucratic protocols that end all support. Then the Imperium does abandon its citizens. Just slowly, with paperwork, instead of directly. Yes, Ven's hands trembled more violently now. She made no effort to hide it. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension, Thane. It encompasses millions of worlds, trillions of souls, resources measured in scales that render individual lives meaningless in calculation. It operates on principles of brutal efficiency because anything less would collapse under its own scale. We save who we can. We sacrifice who we must. We maintain fictions that allow the machinery to function. And we tell ourselves it is better than the alternatives. She paused, closing her augmetic eyes as if praying or gathering strength. I don't know if that is true anymore. I have not known for decades. But I continue because I lack the certainty to stop. What happens if I release this documentation? You will be executed for treason. Your data will be classified and buried. Strategic planning will continue receiving the same falsified reports from my other cartographers. Nothing will change except one more person will have died believing truth mattered more than practical necessity. Ven opened her eyes, focusing on my face. Or you will accept your role in a necessary evil and continue your service. You will process transmissions, confirm settlements, update charts, and try to find meaning in the knowledge that some settlements, the real ones, receive aid because you helped maintain the system's viability. You will compromise your principles to serve the living, and you will learn to live with that weight as I have. Those are not choices. Those are different forms of complicity. Welcome to the Imperium, Thane. Her voice carried neither mockery nor sympathy. There are no clean choices, only degrees of damnation. You may choose which damnation you can bear. I left her office carrying my encrypted data slate, walking through archive corridors that now felt like tombs, surrounded by records of the dead and the dying and the abandoned maintained with perfect precision by people who knew their work served a lie. I understood now why Halloran had warned me away from investigation. He had reached this point himself once, had made his choice, had learned to function within the constraints of necessary evil. I understood why Ven trembled, why her voice held such wariness, why she spoke of weight. This was the burden of knowledge. This was the cost of understanding how the Imperium truly functioned behind its grand rhetoric of unity and service. That night, I knelt before the small shrine in my quarters, before the image of the Emperor enthroned in gold and glory, and I tried to pray. The words would not come. I had recited these prayers thousands of times across 16 years of service. I had believed them. I had felt their power sustaining my faith in the system I served. Now they felt hollow, empty sounds masking desperate hope. I wondered if the Emperor himself was another fiction, another necessary deception maintained to prevent humanity's collapse into despair. I wondered if everything I believed was simply another layer in an architecture of lies, designed to make continued suffering bearable. I returned to work the next day because I lacked courage to do otherwise. I processed transmissions. I confirmed settlements. I updated charts. I performed my function with mechanical precision while my mind screamed at the futility of it. I watched other cartographers performing the same tasks, wondered which of them knew the truth and which remained blissfully ignorant, and I could not decide which state was preferable. Ignorance allowed faith. Knowledge demanded compromise. Both led to the same destination, complicity in a system built on managed deception. During a rest period 3 months after my final meeting with Ven, I received an unexpected summons to the Archive's Central Administration section. I was escorted by armed militarum guards, which I took as confirmation my investigation had been noted at levels beyond my supervisor. I was brought to an office I had never entered before, furnished with luxury inappropriate to standard administratum facilities. Behind a desk of polished wood sat a man in munitorum regalia, his uniform bearing rank insignia marking him as subsector command-level authority. He dismissed the guards and gestured for me to sit. Cartographic Analyst Thane, he began without preamble. You have been conducting unauthorized investigation into intelligence integrity within your assigned grid sections. You have documented systematic inconsistencies between cartographic data and supporting demographic records. You have compiled evidence suggesting deliberate falsification of settlement registries for purposes of strategic planning manipulation. He paused, watching my reaction. All of this activity has been monitored and evaluated. I am here to provide you with context you currently lack. He explained that the Phantom Settlement Program was not corruption or failure, but deliberate policy implemented at subsector command level with full knowledge and authorization from strategic planning itself. The Imperium Nihilus existed in a state of protracted crisis that could not be resolved with available resources. Total abandonment would trigger warp instability feedback loops, making the entire sector uninhabitable and potentially expanding the Great Rift further. But full support was impossible without abandoning other critical sectors facing their own crisis. The solution was managed support based on falsified intelligence, suggesting the sector remained marginally viable. This maintained minimal resource flow sufficient to prevent total collapse while avoiding unsustainable commitment. The system, he told me, functions because everyone involved understands its necessity. Strategic planning requires justification for continued resource allocation. We provide that justification through cartographic data showing sufficient viable settlements. They allocate minimal resources that save some lives while knowing those resources are insufficient to save all lives. The deception is mutual, the complicity is shared, and the alternative is extinction for millions who might otherwise survive another generation. You are telling me the Imperium deliberately abandons its citizens while maintaining the appearance of support. I am telling you the Imperium triages on scales that render individual lives meaningless in calculation. Resources are always insufficient. Threats are always overwhelming. Someone must decide who lives and who dies. We have chosen to save some while sacrificing others. The Phantom Settlement Program allows us to maintain that triage without public acknowledgement of the scale of losses. It is not ideal. It is simply the best available option given constraints we cannot overcome. And my documentation will be classified and archived. You have demonstrated exceptional analytical capability and thorough understanding of systemic architecture. These qualities make you valuable for potential advancement to positions of greater responsibility, or they make you a liability requiring neutralization. The choice is yours. He leaned forward, his expression neither threatening nor reassuring. Thane, you have uncovered truths most cartographers never glimpse. You have seen behind the machinery. Now you must decide whether you possess the strength to serve anyway, knowing what you know. Can you continue mapping phantom settlements to save real populations? Can you maintain the deception that keeps resources flowing to the dying? Can you sacrifice your principles to serve the living? And if I cannot, then you will be reassigned to duties that do not require clearance access. You will spend the remainder of your service maintaining servitor equipment or organizing storage archives. You will remain useful in some capacity, but you will not return to cartographic work. Your knowledge will be sequestered. Your documentation will be buried, and someone else will sit at your desk processing transmissions and updating charts and maintaining the system you refuse to serve. He paused. The machinery continues, Thane, with you or without you. The only question is whether you choose to shape its function or be discarded by its necessity. I looked at this commander of subsector logistics, this administrator of managed atrocity, and I understood he was offering me a choice between different forms of damnation precisely as Venn had predicted. I could become what the system required, advancing through ranks by demonstrating willingness to maintain necessary deceptions, gaining authority to perhaps influence which settlements received real support and which were abandoned. Or I could refuse, preserve my principles, and surrender even the minimal agency my current position afforded. Both choices led to the same conclusion. I would remain complicit. The only variable was the degree of my active participation. I need time to consider, I told him. You have until the end of this shift. Report your decision to Supervisor Venn. He stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. For what it is worth. Thane, I respect your struggle with this. I wrestled with the same questions when I learned these truths. I made my choice. I have lived with it for 40 years. I don't know if I made the right choice. I have never known. But I made the choice someone had to make, and I carried the weight because someone had to carry it. Now, that burden passes to you. I returned to my desk in a state of numbness that felt like drowning in cold water. I sat before my cogitator, before the master charts, before the blessed quill that had marked thousands of coordinates across 16 years. I thought about Mordant's hope, the real settlement I had helped save through accurate reporting. I thought about the phantom settlements whose false transmissions kept the sector viable for strategic planning. I thought about the real settlements I had failed to forward because they were deemed unsalvageable, left to die in silence so their resources could support more viable populations. The mathematics were clear. If I refused to participate, someone else would take my position and continue the deception without my knowledge or documentation. The system would function exactly as before. But if I continued serving, I could at least choose which real settlements to prioritize in my limited forwarding quota. I could exercise tiny authority to save some lives I might not save otherwise. The compromise was real. The damnation was real. But so was the possibility of minimizing harm within constraints I could not overcome. I thought about faith, about the prayers I could no longer recite with conviction, about the emperor enthroned in distant Terra who perhaps watched these calculations with divine understanding, or perhaps did not exist, except as another necessary fiction. I thought about precision, about accuracy, about the difference between documenting truth and serving the living. I thought about Ven's trembling hands, about the subsector commander's 40 years of wait, about Halloran's careful blank expression maintained across decades of complicity. And I made my choice. I encrypted my documentation with the highest level security I could implement and stored it in the deepest archives accessible to my clearance. I updated my settlement registries to include notations distinguishing phantom settlements from real ones. Coded in language only I would recognize, I prepared quarterly reports for strategic planning that maintained the required fiction while prioritizing real settlements. I judged most salvageable for support forwarding. I became what the system required, a knowing participant in necessary deception, performing precision work in service of managed atrocity, sacrificing principles to preserve minimal agency in an architecture of lies. I reported my decision to Ven at shift's end. She looked at me with her clicking augmetic eyes and nodded once. "Welcome to burden, Tane. May the Emperor grant you strength to bear it." Her voice held neither satisfaction nor sympathy, only recognition that I had joined the ranks of those who knew and chose to continue anyway. I continued my service for another 7 years, advancing through clearance levels, gaining access to broader intelligence, discovering that every system I examined operated on similar principles of managed deception and brutal triage. The entire administratum functioned as a vast machinery of compromise, making impossible choices based on insufficient information, allocating inadequate resources to overwhelming threats, maintaining fictions that prevented collapse, while accepting that survival meant sacrificing those who could not be saved. I learned that the Phantom Settlement program was minor compared to other deceptions. I learned about whole sectors written off as losses while their populations continued transmitting desperate pleas for aid that would never arrive. I learned about resource convoys deliberately misdirected to serve political priorities rather than genuine need. I learned about execution quotas maintained to demonstrate strength of will, about purges targeting innocent populations to satisfy doctrinal requirements, about wars prolonged because stalemate served strategic interests better than resolution. I learned that the Imperium I had believed in, the vast coordinated enterprise dedicated to humanity's survival, was real, but not in the way I had imagined. It was not benevolent or just or even efficient. It was brutal and desperate, and willing to sacrifice anything that could be sacrificed to preserve itself. It measured success not in lives saved, but in systems maintained. It valued order over mercy, fear over hope, continued existence over quality of existence. And it demanded that servants, like myself, participate in its function while knowing the terrible costs that function imposed. I learned to live with weight. I learned to process phantom transmissions without flinching. I learned to mark settlements for abandonment without allowing myself to imagine the faces of those I condemned. I learned to recite prayers I no longer believed while maintaining appearance of faith. I learned to be efficient at damnation, and I learned that knowing the truth changed nothing except the burden of carrying it. In my 23rd year of service, I received intelligence that the entire subsector containing my assigned grid sections had been reclassified for strategic withdrawal. The Great Rift had expanded further. Demonic incursions had reached unsustainable frequency. Strategic planning had determined continued resource allocation represented unacceptable loss potential. All settlements within the affected region, real and phantom alike, would be removed from active support consideration. The sector would be allowed to fail. Millions would die, but their deaths would free resources for deployment to more viable regions. I processed the reclassification order with steady hands. I updated the master charts, marking vast sections with the notation, Ciontiract las tres realevod. I filed reports confirming the withdrawal while noting estimated population losses in coded language only other initiated analysts would recognize. I performed my function precisely, professionally, without visible reaction. Then I returned to my quarters, knelt before the shrine I no longer believed in, and tried once more to pray. The words would not come. They had not come for years. But I knelt anyway, maintaining the form of faith long after its substance had dissolved, because the form was all that remained. I thought about the real settlements I had prioritized, the small numbers of lives I had perhaps helped preserve through careful allocation of my limited forwarding quota. I thought about the phantoms I had maintained, the false hope that had kept resources flowing just a little longer. I thought about whether any of it had mattered, whether my compromises had achieved anything beyond extending suffering by small increments. I decided it had not mattered. The sector would fall regardless of my choices. The people would die regardless of my service. The machinery would continue regardless of my participation. I had sacrificed my principles for agency that proved meaningless in scales beyond my influence. I had become complicit in necessary evil that turned out to be neither necessary nor lesser. I had carried weight that crushed me without preserving anyone. But I also decided to document everything, to leave testimony for whoever might discover it after I was gone, to create a record that stated clearly what I had learned, what choices I had made, what costs the Imperium's function imposed on those who served it. Not because documentation would change anything, not because anyone would read it and reform the system, but because bearing witness was the last service I could perform that felt like truth. I am writing this now from a cell in the subsector detention facility. I was arrested 3 days after submitting a report to strategic planning that detailed the Phantom settlement program, the systematic falsification of intelligence, the scale of abandonment disguised as triage. I knew the report would trigger my arrest. I submitted it anyway. I chose to stop being complicit, knowing the choice was meaningless, but unable to continue carrying weight I no longer believed served any purpose. They will execute me tomorrow at the third bell. Charges are treason through unauthorized intelligence disclosure. No trial will be held. No defense will be permitted. I will be logged as cartographic analyst Tain executed of Far Haras in some archive, my true offense buried beneath false charges, my testimony sequestered and buried so deep it will never surface. The machinery will continue without me. Someone else sits at my desk now, processing transmissions, confirming settlements, maintaining the deception I refused to sustain. I am not a hero. I am not a martyr. I am a man who learned terrible truths and lacked the strength to either serve them or forget them. I chose complicity until I could not bear it, then chose useless defiance that will change nothing except ending my life. I served the Imperium faithfully for 23 years and achieved nothing except documenting how deeply its corruption ran. But I will die having spoken truth one final time. I will die having refused to bow to necessity I no longer believed served the living. I will die knowing I chose conscience over survival even when conscience offered no victory. That is not redemption. It is not even meaningful resistance. But it is the only dignity I have left to preserve. To you who may somehow discover this testimony buried in archives or smuggled from my cell by sympathetic hands, understand. The Imperium does not function as you believe. It is not benevolent. It is not just. It is not even particularly competent at the survival it claims to prioritize. It is brutal machinery that consumes millions to preserve itself, that manufactures fictions to justify continued existence, that demands complicity from all who serve it while knowing the terrible costs that service imposes. You serve a system built on managed atrocity. You maintain an architecture of lies. And the worst truth is that there may be no alternative, no better option within constraints of scale and threat that crush individual choices into meaninglessness. I do not know if the Emperor is real or another fiction maintained to prevent despair. I do not know if humanity's survival justifies the horrors inflicted in its name. I do not know if my service preserved any lives or simply extended suffering incrementally. I know only that I was asked to choose between complicity and extinction, between lesser evil and greater collapse, between truth and necessity. And I discovered that I could not bear the weight of those choices, that I lacked the strength others possessed to continue serving while knowing what I knew. Tomorrow I die. The Imperium continues. The sector falls. The machinery grinds forward. And somewhere in the archives, 7 phantom settlements I once confirmed will remain marked on ancient charts, false coordinates maintained with blessed quill on sacred parchment, testifying to nothing except how thoroughly we learned to deceive ourselves in service of survival. My name is Corvus Thane. I was third-class cartographic analyst of the Departamento Munitorum Subsector Command. I served faithfully until I learned faith and truth were incompatible. I chose truth when it mattered least, when it could save no one, when it served only to ease my conscience before death. I am complicit in every phantom settlement I confirmed, every real settlement I abandoned, every quarterly report that maintained deceptions, allowing strategic planning to justify minimal support for maximum suffering. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not seeking redemption. I am simply bearing witness one final time to what I learned, that the Imperium's survival demands damnation from all who serve it, and that damnation comes in degrees we must each choose to bear or refuse. I refused. I die for it. And nothing changes except one less person carries weight that crushed me. The third bell will ring soon. They will come for me. I will walk to execution with whatever dignity remains. And the archives will record that cartographic analyst Corvus Thane died for heresy. His true testimony buried, his documentation classified, his service erased except as cautionary example. The machinery continues. It always continues. May the Emperor, if he exists and cares, grant mercy to those who remain and bear what I could not. This testimony ends.